Good morning, church. Hope you are doing well this morning. So before I launch into the sermon today, on Wednesday this week, WOW is back. Can I get an amen? I know a lot of you have been waiting for this, and it is interesting. Throughout the spring, I more and more often get asked, when is WOW coming back? And it's coming back this Wednesday. So if you don't know what WOW is, every summer for a long time, we worship on Wednesday nights for a solid hour. And Scott Young, our worship minister, and whole team of people that surround him do a really good job planning some just really meaningful worship times together. We always learn new songs, which is really fun as well. And it's just a really, really good time to connect with the Lord. So that starts this Wednesday at 6:30, and I certainly hope that you are there. Well, I've been thinking about this Sunday for a while this spring, so I've been in this series called Everyday Idolatry, and I knew that the early lessons would be set up lessons talking about idolatry in the Bible and laying some foundational principles for how we are actually the ones that create our own idols, and then eventually these idols have destructive power over us. And then I knew as the series developed I'd have to tackle some of the big ones. And so today is one of those days. If you're a parent of a child, you should have received an email just as a heads up. We're tackling the idol of sex today. If you didn't get that email, or if you're a guest, you're thinking, why did I pick this Sunday as the Sunday to come to Memorial Road? This is your warning, like right now. If you need to get up in the middle of the sermon or beginning the sermon, you are welcome to do that. In fact, praying up to this sermon, I did pray. I said, Lord, if you want to come back before I preach this sermon, I'm fine with that. Like, I would welcome that. So, anyway, let me begin with a story I heard recently. Well, a reflection on a word. There is a certain word, and it's held in very positive esteem throughout pretty much every discipline of life, and the word is love. So it doesn't really matter if you're a Christian, not a Christian, if you're an atheist. The word love is a really positive word. It's used all the time. The odd part about that word is that though it's a very positive word, the definition of the word is very ambiguous. Anytime you can say something and finish the sentence with God or pizza, you know that the word is ambiguous. So I love God, I love pizza, it's the same word. I actually think that the ancients, they had it more accurate. In the ancient world, there were multiple words they had to describe love. They had eros, they had phileo, they had agape. Today we just have love, and it means a lot of things. I heard a youth minister recently tell this story where he's about to start class on a Wednesday. This girl comes up to him. She's 15 years old. She's really nervous, and she says, hey, I don't know how to say this, but you see that guy sitting on the back row? And the youth minister says, yeah, I see him. And she says, he's going to have to leave. And the youth minister smiles and says, oh, well, this is church. Like, everybody's welcome at church. I can't just ask the guy to leave, and I don't even recognize him. He's probably a guest, and he needs to be welcomed. And the girl said, well, you don't understand. I have a restraining order against him. He's a stalker. So the guy's 18 years old, the girl's 15 years old, and so the youth minister walks up to the 18-year-old guy, and he says, hey, can you come outside with me? And takes him outside and says, I don't want to be mean or anything, but it sounds like you have a restraining order against you towards this girl, and so you really can't be at youth group tonight. And the 18-year-old boy fell on his knees and started crying and said, but you don't understand, I have to be here. I have to be in the same room as her. I have to see her because I love her. That's not love. Now, he might say that. That might be the word he uses, but that's not love. That is self-serving infatuation. In fact, you might call it an idol. So Tim Keller, he wrote a book on idolatry, and he has a pretty good definition of idolatry. If we'll put this on the screen, he says, what's an idol? Anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give what only God can give. Anything so central and essential to your life that should you lose it, your life would feel hardly worth living. It's a pretty good definition of an idol. Romance and all that goes with it has become the most pervasive, accepted, and worshiped god of our day. Look at the lyrics from a few songs over the last few years and or decades. Sting, you're my religion and my church. You're my holy grail at the end of my search. Hosier, worship in the bedroom. The only heaven I'll be sent is when I'm alone with you. Or one recognizable one from recent times here is Justin Bieber. The way you hold me feels so holy. Romance is talked about today with the same language as in former years we talked about God. Romance has been deified. It's become everything. Sex has become the end-all be-all of life. It is the holy grail of our world today. It's everyone's quest to discover it. It drives our economy. It saturates our shows. It sells our products. It fills our news feeds. It permeates our culture. It makes us anxious. It fuels our debates. Breaks families apart. So one question I want to begin with is, how did we get here? Like, what happened to get this to the point that we are today? And there's two answers to that. In one sense, there's nothing new under the sun. So this is, in some sense, this is the way that it's always been. There's actually really interesting passages in the Bible which talk about how sex and romance can be worshipped. In fact, I found this really interesting. So in the New Testament, there's what we call vice lists. And what a vice list is, it's a list of behaviors that run counter to the will of God. So it's the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit list. There's about 9 of these lists in the New Testament. I got all 9 lists out, and I opened an Excel document, and I typed out every sin listed on these 9 vice lists. And it was really interesting. So of the 9 lists, there's 46 individual sinful actions. 46. There's a lot of them. Maybe you can guess what the top 2 are. So there's one particular sin that shows up on all 9 lists. That's the number 1. And the second one shows up on 8 out of the 9 lists. The number 1 sin, as far as frequency goes, is idolatry. Number 2, sexual immorality. And usually they're together on the list. Isn't that interesting? Every time that these lists are voiced in the New Testament, it's Romans 1, it's Ephesians 3, it's Colossians 5, Revelation 21, Revelation 22, 1 Peter 4. So multiple authors describing the behaviors that run counter to the will of God. And what do they put? Idolatry. Sexual immorality. So they go together. This is not just the New Testament thing, but in the Old Testament, you actually find them paired quite a bit as well. So, for example, here's 2 verses. One from Hosea, which says, "My people consult a wooden idol. Therefore, your daughters turn to prostitution. The men themselves consort with harlots." So that's all tied up together. Or there's a really interesting verse in Isaiah chapter 57, where Isaiah writes that you've put up pagan symbols. In fact, he says, you've put up pagan symbols behind closed doors. Like you've put up these idols in your homes. And then he rolls right into this next sentence, you've made a pact with those whose beds you love. And so they go together in the Bible, idolatry and sexual immorality. So in one sense, you could argue, well, there's nothing really new here. This is what's been happening for thousands of years. However, I don't know about you, but there's part of me that just thinks something's slightly different now with this culture, 21st century. Like, it just feels different. Feels more pervasive. Feels more aggressive. Feels more accepted than at other points in history. And I could give you lots of examples here. I'm just going to share one. Recently, I was at a conference, and I had some downtime, and I was wandering around this conference center, and I accidentally wandered into a child beauty pageant. Now, I have nothing against children looking beautiful, but this was a very odd phenomenon, and if you've been to one of these, you know what I'm talking about. But what happens is they take all the seduction you could put on a grown woman, all the sensuality there, and they're placing it on an 8-year-old girl who's walking around dressed exactly like you would find that same girl who's in her 20s, very, very seductive. It's an odd thing to observe. It's off-putting. But what it does help me understand, at least, is I feel like I can see an idol more clearly when it is projected from the adult world and displayed onto the innocence of a child. And so I only tell that story just to say it just feels different. And maybe you can come up with examples on your own. So how did we get here to this particular version of it? I want to give you 3 factors from the past that play into the present. So first one is this: it's the rise of individualism. I've talked about this in sermons a lot over the last few years, but this is a significant sociological factor which has really played into how sex is seen in culture today. So in years gone by, especially a few centuries ago, you knew who you were because of your clan or your tribe or your family, your group, your faith, your church. Your identity was formed in the context of community. Lauren Daigle, her most popular song, the lyric says, "I am who you say that I am." So that's identity formed through something outside myself. Who I am is defined based on who you say that I am. Well, that's really shifted now. Now it's more like, I am who I say I am. So identity formation has shifted from something that we derive outside ourselves to something that we come to and discover inside ourselves. Robert C. Roberts, an author, he writes this. He says, "We have been led to feel that the self is sacrosanct. Just as in an earlier time it was thought never fitting to deny God, so now it seems never right to deny oneself." Isn't that an interesting thought? In years gone by, again, to deny God would be thought of as really bad. Oh no, you can't deny God. But today, it's denying of self, which is seen as wrong and bad. You can't deny yourself. That's wrong. That's oppressive. In other words, one way I would articulate the mantra today is this: when you want to know what's real, pay attention to how you feel. When you want to know what's real, pay attention to how you feel. And so this factor, the rise of individualism, has really played into how we see sex in the world today. Now here's the second reason: the work of Sigmund Freud. So a little bit of philosophical history here. Prior to Freud, most people thought of problems in the world through an Augustinian lens. So Augustine was a 4th century philosopher. He's a Christian, and his view of the world was that what's wrong with the world is what he called disordered loves. So when our loves or our desires get out of order as far as priority goes, that's when you find problems. So if I love my job more than I love God, something's going to go wrong with my life. If I love my own children more than I love God, something's going to go wrong with my life. That was Augustine. Freud really changed the game on this one. So for Sigmund Freud, he argued that yes, we have lots of desires and lots of loves in life. However, he said that the most important desire in all of life is libido, sexual desire. And he wrote that all of life is connected to that desire. And then the thing that he wrote that's made the most impact in the world in the years since he was alive is this. He wrote that the repression of that desire is the basis for all neurosis in life. In other words, if you don't act on those desires, like if you don't follow that impulse, if you don't pursue that relationship, if you don't pursue that encounter that you want, that's when you'll suffer, so Freud says. So he would say all the pain and all the problems and all the disorders that we feel are because we repress libido. Now, those ideas have dominated the world ever since Sigmund Freud was alive. John Mark Comer wrote a book about a year ago, and he had this to say. He said, he really combines these first two factors. He says, in the new religion of self, which is a really interesting phrase, the religion of self. In the new religion of self, what our ancestors called chastity is now called oppression if it's externally imposed, and it's called repression if it's internally imposed. That's an interesting thought there. So let me give you some examples of what he's talking about here. So the sermon I'm preaching today, trying to think about sexuality from a biblical perspective and underneath the sovereignty of Christ, 100 years ago, this sermon would be seen as a sermon about chastity, and it would have been thought of as a positive idea. Nowadays, there's a lot of people that would say this sermon is oppressive because it's trying to think about sexuality from the perspective of religion. That has to be oppressive. Or let's talk about the internal world here. So if a couple decides in their own heart, you know what, we're going to wait till we get married to have sex. 100 years ago, that's called chastity, and it's a good thing. Today, that's called repression. You're doing something wrong. So something has shifted here. And what I'm saying is that at least some of that can be attributed back to the philosopher and psychologist Sigmund Freud. So we got the Rise of Individualism, work of Sigmund Freud. Here's a third factor which has led to what we see today as far as the worship of sex in the world. I call this the Great Reduction. There's probably other names for this. This also comes from the book by John Mark Comer. He traces the history of what has happened, culturally speaking, to our view of sex in the last 60 years. And I call this the Great Reduction. So in the 1960s, you have what's known in our country's history as the sexual revolution. And what happens here is that, or a lot of things happen, but one thing is that the number of couples living together skyrockets. And so what happens in the 60s is you have sex is now separated from commitment. Like, I don't have to be committed to have sex. And then at the end of the 60s, in 1969, you have the legalization of the no-fault divorce. So now it's really easy to get divorced. And so at this point, sex is not only separated from commitment, it's also separated from marriage itself. Like, I don't even have to be in the institution of marriage to do this. Marriages can come to fruition and be dissolved so easily. In the 70s, you have the legalization of abortion, which then further separates sex from procreation. So this isn't really about new life anymore. So it's not about commitment, it's not about marriage, it's not about new life. And then you can even fast forward to today. You can talk about Tinder came out in 2012, this dating app. So at this point, not only is sex separate from commitment, marriage, procreation, now it's even been separated from relationship itself. Like, it has nothing to do with actually relating on any emotional level to another human being. That's why I call it the Great Reduction. It's been stripped away of all these things that have been tied to it for a long time. So what's left? What's left is an appetite. That's what I would say sex is today, at least in seen by this culture. It's just an appetite. It's no different than hunger. It's no different than thirst. Human beings are animals. We want it. We need it. We will do everything in our power, and we should do everything in our power to get it and to customize it to our preferences, even if that involves stalking a girl on a Wednesday night youth class. our modern idolatry of sex, in my mind, has not liberated sex. We've taken sex captive. So think about this for a minute. When an empire conquers another people, it will often rob that people of their history and their meanings and their values and their beliefs. So too, contemporary culture has colonized sexuality itself, taking away her history and her meaning and her value. Now, someone might say, Phil, you're being really short-sighted. What the world needed is exactly what happened. The world needed sex to be pulled away from its religious underpinnings. This is exactly what needed to happen. Fair point. Maybe that's true. I would want to then continue the conversation by pointing us to this question. What has this shift actually produced in the world? This shift to sex is God. This shift to body is appetite. What has this produced? Like, what evidence do we see in the world? Since the 1960s, happiness levels have gone down in the U.S. Pornography is a billion-dollar industry. It's getting darker and more violent and more misogynistic than ever before. Sex addiction is more prevalent than it's ever been. Sexual abuse, sexual assault are getting worse. Currently, 1/4 of women in this country will experience sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. So is the shift necessarily helping our world? I would say it's not. And in fact, the greatest casualty, I haven't even mentioned it yet, the people who are really suffering from the worship of sex is our children. Now that sex has been separated from marriage and separated from commitment, now that sex is just play for grown-ups, our children are reaping unimaginable consequences from this. 25% of kids grow up today without a father in their life. The number of kids with mental health disorders related to an unstable home is going through the roof. There was an interesting study done in the UK about what does it cost the taxpayer when a family splits. So they did this big study, and like when you take into account tax, benefits, housing, health care, social care, civil and criminal justice, and education, like how much is this actually costing the taxpayers? And again, this is UK. I couldn't find it for the US. In the UK, it's $50 or $65 billion a year. And so you have to imagine that number is much higher than that in the US. Author Harry Benson says this: family breakdown is a social justice issue. With its appalling pain and distress, it's at an epidemic level and lies at the root of almost all of society's problems. It particularly affects our children, and it's the primary cause of inequality. So why do all these kids have such unstable homes today? There's a lot of reasons for that, but one reason is this: I believe innocent children have become the collateral damage of our worship of sex. Now, is that what we wanted? Like, now as believers, like, is this really what we want with the world? Like back to the original premise of the entire series, I preached this in lesson 1 like a month ago, or maybe it was 5 weeks ago. We create our gods out of things that we want, out of things that we need, out of things that we fear. We create them. And they become the ideologies of our day that are so prevalent that they simply become the air we breathe, and we accept them as true. And then after we create our gods, eventually we become like our gods. That's what Psalm 115 says. And then after we become like our gods, eventually we're destroyed by these gods. We make them, we become like them, we're destroyed by them. So what in the world do we do? And this is really hard. I want to go to one text and just make an observation or two. 1 Corinthians 6. Paul writes these words. He quotes here from a saying that people in Corinth know very well. And the saying is this: you say, food for the stomach and the stomach for food, but God will destroy them both. And so here's what this saying really means. So in ancient Corinth, the view of the body was that the body's temporary. Like the body's just this corrupted house for an eternal soul. And so the soul is what lasts forever. The body is just this temporary housing mechanism, and so it doesn't really matter. It's just a thing. It's gonna go away at some point. So what you do with your body, it doesn't really matter, because your body is going to go away someday. And so sex to the body is what food is to the stomach. So it's just an appetite. That's what they thought back then. One day it's going to be cast aside, so who really cares? And this is why in the same chapter Paul says he's again quoting this saying from the Corinthians, which is everything is permissible. I can do anything because it's all going to go away. Paul counters this view with some pretty remarkable teaching about sex and some remarkable teaching about the body. So here's what he writes next. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality. And notice he doesn't say the body's not meant for sex, because sex is good and God made it. Paul says the body's not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? I mean, this is a remarkable bit of biblical teaching here, because what Paul does here is he counters a reductionist view of body as appetite with a holistic view of body as sacred. Notice Paul does not berate the Corinthians here. He doesn't condemn them. He simply introduces a really positive, hopeful view of the human body. Your body's made for God. Your body is in union with God. Your body will be raised by God. In other words, what Paul is saying here is that you are so much more than just an appetite. You are so much more than just a release of dopamine. You are a being with creative agency. You can think and laugh and build and run. You are, and this is so amazing to get your mind around, you are in eternal union with God himself. Like your body is a spiritual extension of Jesus Christ. So as Christ loves, our bodies can love. And as Christ prays, our bodies can pray. As Christ forgives, our bodies forgive. As Christ sacrifices himself for others, so we, through our bodies, can sacrifice ourselves for somebody else. The only way to make the invisible Christ visible to the world is through your body. Like your body is good. In fact, we live in a world today where we talk a lot about body image, and there's a lot of people that don't have a healthy body image, and they don't like their bodies. The Bible has an incredible view of the human body. Like God himself has a really positive body image. I mean, think about some of the verses in Scripture about the human body. Psalm 139, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. 1 Corinthians 6, this passage I'm reading now, Paul goes on to say, your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. I mean, just get your mind around that. Your body is this housing mechanism for the presence of God himself. He goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 6 that you were bought at a price. God loves the human body. And he does not evaluate the human body based on modern contours of attraction. God evaluates and loves the human body based on seeing the imprint of himself in the human body. You are a temple of the Holy Spirit. You're not just an appetite. Now, do we have appetites in our bodies? Yes. And they're not inherently evil. They're actually really, really important. Our appetites are. In many ways, our appetites are the thing that keeps us alive and moving. However, our appetites are important, but our appetites are not our identity. So go back to the moment in the Gospels. Jesus, he's in the garden, or he's in the wilderness, being tempted by Satan. And Jesus says to Satan, when he's being tempted to eat this bread while Jesus is fasting, Jesus says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Now, when Jesus says this, he's been fasting for 40 days. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. What is Jesus really getting at here? Here's what I think he's getting at. I think Jesus discovered in fasting from food that he could differentiate himself from his appetite. I am not my next meal. I am the beloved of God. And so learning to control his own body, I'm talking about Jesus here, learning to control the body paved the way for him to sacrifice his body for the sake of the world. I mean, think about the cross, the death of Jesus, and what it accomplished. The forgiveness of sins, the launching of the new kingdom of God, the defeat of death itself, the destruction of the powers of the enemy. We call it Passion Week, the Passion event. The ultimate passion of Jesus came from the harnessing of temporary passion. In other words, let's get back to you and me. Your best life is not the blind pursuit of every desire. Your best life is the disciplined pursuit of the deepest desire. In other words, if you become a yes man or a yes woman to your own appetite, then people are going to have a hard time coming up with good things to say about you at your funeral. Like if you just go through your life saying yes, 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 yes to every single appetite that you have just because you want it, what you'll do is your whole life will be about the exaltation of the self, and in the wake of your great and glorious self will be all the other people that you ran over to get to this self-serving point. You know, there's nothing quite like the moment when a family member is passing away and others are gathered in the room in the final hours or the final days of that person's life. Many of you have been in those rooms and you know what I'm talking about. If you've not been in a room with someone who's about to pass away, it's a really sacred moment. Often what happens is loved ones gather around the bed and they lean in and they're trying to listen to any final whispers of the beloved. There's a gravity to the moment. There's a weight to the room. It's almost as if the people who are standing around the one that's about to pass away, it's almost as if they know that this person's about to be with the Lord in a different kind of way. And so there's this immense weight to that moment. Now, why exactly do we feel that way when we're about to say goodbye to a loved one? Here's how I would couch it. Here's the words, the phrase I would use. I would say the reason we feel like it's such a sacred moment is because we at that moment are playing host to the holy. Like we're in the room. This loved one is about to pass away and be with the Lord in a new, beautiful way, and so we're a host of something that's really, really holy. So here's what I want you to think about your body. Your body is a host of the holy. God died for you, and not only that, God lives. He lives in you. Like your heart is the home of God, and He lives in you because He loves you. And so this really adds a lot of weight and power to the very next thing that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6. So with this in mind, you are a host of the holy, and God lives in you because He loves you. Then Paul says, shall I take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. You are home base and launch pad to the presence of God in the world. And so what then is the function of your sexuality? It's a gift given to you by God, just like it was given to Adam and Eve, in order to bring stability, order, structure, and life to the world. And so what happens is when your telos, we get the word telescope, it means the end game or the goal, like it can mean goal. So when your telos or your goal when the telos of your sexuality is yourself, society crumbles. But when the telos of your sexuality becomes the benefit of another, society flourishes. See, we have reduced sex into an individual act for personal benefit that leads to temporary pleasure. But when you read the Bible, sex is a divine gift for communal blessing that leads to eternal pleasure. I think the stability of this country or any country is tied to the stability of the home, and I think the stability of the home is tied to the sacredness of sex. And I think we need to resurrect it in what it was meant to be. The last scene I'll give to you, and then we'll be done with this sermon, is there's a moment in the Gospels where Jesus goes to Samaria intentionally. He was supposed to go around it. He goes right into the heart of it. And he meets this woman that no one wants to talk to. She's had 5 different husbands. She's not living with her husband. In other words, she is living a lifestyle totally counter to what Yahweh would want her to do with her sexuality. And what's amazing in the story is Jesus does not berate her. He does not condemn her. He listens to her. He treats her with honor and dignity and respect. And then in the middle of this conversation, Jesus says something really powerful to her. He says, if you never want to be thirsty again, you need to drink living water. And so for a lot of us, and this really goes with any idol, we have gone to wells that run dry. The idol of sex, the idol of money, the idol of power, yeah, they're really enticing, but at the end of the day, they run dry. And if you want to be satisfied with your life, you got to have living water, and the living water comes from Christ. And so the only thing I can tell you as we close this particular message this morning is that Jesus invites you into himself and into his life and into his heart, and you won't be disappointed when you make him the Lord of your life. He bought you with a price because he loves you. And so we're going to sing about that, and as we sing this next song, if there is any need that you have or any way that you want to respond on this day in this particular message, you're welcome to do so. Let's stand and sing.